In this lecture, we're going to be looking at the stream that comes more out of an Eastern inflected approach to philosophy and healing. In the last lecture, I looked at groups like Christian Science and New Thought. However, by the early 20th century, they were also, certainly New Thought was being influenced by Eastern ideas. That was a larger kind of cultural process. But this really gains ground in the counterculture of the 60s. Now, the diagram here is of a more traditional Indian depiction of the chakras and the subtle body, and this has a kind of fertilizing effect, particularly emerging out of a group called the Theosophical Society, who is the most important in terms of bringing philosophical ideas out of Hinduism and Buddhism into the West. So I'll be talking a bit about them and then moving us into the contemporary period. But certainly what we start to see is a coming together of attitudes. We already looked at Mesmer, that idea that there's subtle energy, that the body is energy. And this seems to be the emerging model from these types of healing from all the different angles, is the idea of an energy body rather than a mechanical body. So I've entitled this lecture, "The Subtle Bodies." As I mentioned, the most important group historically related to bringing ideas from Buddhism and Hinduism into Western awareness is the Theosophical Society. This group was founded in New York City in 1875 by a Russian woman who I'll be talking more about shortly, an American and an Irishman, and it emerges out of the larger Romantic movement, which is in reaction. If some of you have studied English, it's a reaction against all those forces I talked about already: industrialization, urbanization, and so on. We have a society that's really in a state of flux. And so the Theosophical Society emerges from this, and also from the occult movement. And so a lot of these ideas are part of Western folklore and practice, but that were never really written down and were considered kind of in the shadows. So we've seen in our time period, as I've already mentioned, things like tarot. You can buy a tarot deck in a bookstore now, but this would have been considered very unusual practice at the time of the Theosophical Society. They were also interested in astrology, vegetarianism, women's rights. So they're looking at all these different issues, and they want to apply religious and spiritual truths to them. So the Theosophical Society spreads very quickly and opens up chapters all over the world. They're an international organization, and they still are. Their headquarters is now in India, but they open a chapter in Toronto, and I actually did a lot of research on the Toronto Theosophical Society and the issues that they were interested in Toronto at that time. So let's look at the symbol here. So what will stand out, of course, is the swastika, and this is very unfortunate that this symbol has been hijacked. It's a very typical Hindu symbol of auspiciousness and wellness. It's associated with the sun, and it was, I can't go into this, but it was taken by the Nazis in a completely inappropriate way. But it's still very common to see this in India, and it's considered a symbol of, as I said, of auspiciousness. And above that, the Om symbol. Many of you will be familiar with this if you've practiced yoga. And then some Western symbols. So you can see immediately from this that the Theosophical Society is mixing together the East and West. And so the six-pointed star, which according to the Theosophical Society is a symbol of the macrocosm, the Ankh from ancient Egypt, the snake eating its tail. So we're seeing these symbols from different traditions being mixed together, and that's very typical of Theosophy. And it's also a hallmark of the New Age movement, that eclectic mixing together of different traditions. And then their motto there is no religion higher than truth. So this is the larger underpinning of Theosophy, this idea that no one tradition has the truth. All traditions have are parts of the truth in them. The most important thinker in the Theosophical movement is its primary founder, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. She's probably one of the most interesting people of the period, and I could do a whole course on her, and I have taught a course on the occult and spent a lot of time on her. She is a very mysterious figure. She's only been taken seriously in the last, I would say, 20 years or so. She was dismissed as a charlatan during her time by a lot of people, and I don't pretend to know the truth about Blavatsky. She told a lot of tall tales, and in fact, when you look into her biography, the truth is often stranger than what she was making up. So I'm just going to focus on what's important in terms of this course. And so she starts out, at least when she comes into the historical record, she's born into, as far as we know, a Russian aristocratic family, and she flees from an early marriage at the age of around 17, and she's kind of traveling the world from then on. And she's a highly philosophical young woman, and she enters into the historical record as a spiritual medium. And so, as I said in the last lecture, spiritualism was becoming extremely popular, particularly in the Anglosphere, so England, America, Canada. It was becoming very popular. So she's a spiritualist, she's channeling spirits. But by 1875, when the Theosophical Society is founded, she's changed her tact and she's more interested in Eastern philosophy. And so she writes in 1877 her first major work called Isis Unveiled. So you can see from that language, Isis is obviously Egyptian. She's looking more at the Western occult tradition, and over time she writes more and more about Eastern ideas. It's very interesting to note that Isis Unveiled has never been out of print. She's been highly influential, and so that's why I'm focusing on her here. Her ideas, she talks about karma, she talks about all of these different philosophical systems emerging out of India. And so for a lot of people, this is their first introduction to these ideas through Blavatsky. So the stated objectives of the Theosophical Society were to, quote, form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity without distinction of race, creed, sex, caste, or color, to encourage the study of comparative religion, philosophy, and science, and to investigate unexplained laws of nature and the powers latent in human beings. So this is a highly radical set of objects, because you can see here they're saying that all religions, all cultures are equal. This would have been a very radical revolutionary notion at the time. This is a time of Christian missions going into the colonial world and trying to convert people. So this would have been seen as a threat to that, and it was seen as a threat to that. Blavatsky got into a lot of conflict with missionaries in India. And I want to look at what she says about the time period in which she's living. The age of crass materialism, of soul insanity and blindness is swiftly passing away. A death struggle between mysticism and materialism is no longer at hand, but is already raging. So this is what she sees as the central problem of her time, which is crass materialism. So just imagine what she would think of our time period if she thought it was bad then. So she sets herself up as a champion for spiritual values, but not any one religion. So the idea of saving spirituality from these specific dogmas. So this is very much, again, what she's been referred to as the mother of the New Age, these ideas of taking from a variety of religions and emphasizing what's in common with them and so on. So she sees it as a struggle between mysticism and materialism, and that she's championing these spiritual values in her work. I'm showing you here a quotation from The Path, which was a publication first started by William Quan Judge, who was, again, one of the founders of Theosophy. He was born in Ireland and moved to the United States. And it's interesting to see in the publications, and the Theosophist wrote a lot, that they're struggling with how to bring ideas like yoga into the West. And in the beginning, they're much more focusing on the philosophy, which is the opposite of what we see now, where there's a focus on the asana and the physical part. So he writes, a good deal has been said in theosophical literature about the danger of pursuing yoga practice, such as regulating the breathing, so pranayama, assuming certain postures of the body, etc., and several persons not satisfied with simple declarations by such writers as HPB, so that's Blavatsky, that these practices are prejudicial, have frequently asked for reasons. Many of the reasons given in The Path and elsewhere have been merely further declarations. I have instituted some experiments for the purpose of showing what is the effect, if any, upon the physical system of a certain sort of breathing used in the Hatha Yoga practices, and desire to record one for the benefit of inquirers. So the Theosophists are struggling here with what aspects of these traditions will work in a Western setting. And Blavatsky felt that the physical and breath practices were not good. Now, this obviously most people went on and did it anyway. And a lot of theosophists did practice these more physical approaches. But the early theosophists felt that they were inappropriate and that they should sort of just stick with the philosophy. After the death of Blavatsky, a woman named Annie Besant shortly after that becomes the head of the International Theosophical Society. She's an Anglo-Irish woman, and her background was in political activism. She was involved in the fight for women's rights, and so she brings in a very different angle into theosophy that's much more political, and she gets very involved with the Indian independence movement when the Theosophical Center moves to India. But Besant was also interested in mysticism, and so while in India, she starts studying different approaches to health and healing and to the body, and along with Leadbetter, who's a very controversial figure, she writes a number of books about this. And I'm not going to get into the controversy here because if I go into theosophical controversies, I'll spend the whole lecture on that. But just to know, you can see already that women play a very important role in theosophy. So theosophy, not all of the chapters, but certainly many of them were open to this kind of quote unquote new women who were educated and who wanted to take leadership roles both politically and in the spiritual world. This is what Annie Besant has to say about yoga in her book written in published in 1907. It is through these laws that the yogi brings out his hidden powers. Then you will understand also that it is not necessary to go into the mountain or into the desert, to hide yourself in a cave or forest, in order that the union with the self may be obtained. He who is within you and without you. So here we see this idea of bringing these yogic ideas to householders. So traditionally in Hinduism, as I mentioned, things like meditation were mostly practiced by monks or nuns, people who had renounced the world. But we see with Theosophy and a number of movements within India, this idea of bringing these philosophical truths to people who are living in the world. So she's saying, you don't need to go to the mountain or the desert. You don't need to be a renunciant. Yoga is the rational application of the laws of the unfolding of consciousness. By the study of your own mind, you can find out how far ready you are to begin the definite practice of yoga. So basically the idea that these are modes for expanding consciousness, and this is the kind of language we're really going to see in the counterculture and the hippie movement, that interest in the unfolding of consciousness. So it's being talked about very early here in the writing of Annie Besant. As part of the larger process of documents and ideas coming from east to west and going back and forth, by the way, it's not just a one-way street, the documents related to the subtle body become available to these thinkers, people like Blavatsky and Besant. And so they come across the idea of the chakras, these energy centers in the subtle body. And this immediately captures their imagination and continues to capture the imagination of people in the Western world. And many of you will be familiar with this through yoga. So this is an early diagram that the Theosophists developed. This is not typical of the way the Hindus would have done it. They've developed in a slightly different way, but the basic idea is the same. There's also a very important work done called The Serpent Power, which was one of the first translations of tantric texts into English, talking about the subtle body and the chakras. And so this, as I said, has continued to be a really important kind of node through which these ideas are coming into the Western world. The next watershed in these developments comes through the counterculture of the 1960s. Now, most of them were not aware that the Theosophists had gone before them, but they were definitely building on a lot of these ideas. And in the 1960s, as many of you will know, again, just as at the end of the 19th century, the Western culture is in a complete state of turmoil. And there's a variety of reasons for that. Certainly in the United States, there's the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, gay rights movement, the women's rights movement, and this is happening in many countries like Canada and in England as well. And so we see the hippie movement emerging out of this, and many things have been said about this movement. Again, I could do a whole course on this, but I'm showing you a picture here of the Beatles. So this was a very important point where the Beatles, who were probably the most influential group at the time, in terms of the youth anyway, go to India and find a guru. And so you can see they're sitting there with the yogi. And so they're studying yoga, they're studying these practices. So I'm not saying they invented it, but it just blows up at that point. And thousands of people start going to places like India to find a guru and to learn things like yoga. And when they come back, they're bringing a lot of these ideas with them. And so we see the development of new ideas about healing and bringing in these variety of approaches, both through that stream of theosophy and through the stream of the counterculture. So the counterculture is interested in many things, a lot of the same things as the theosophists. They're interested in diet. So we see all kinds of diet, so macrobiotics, vegetarian, and so on. And we also find them interested in body work, massage, chiropractic, all of these kind of alternative health practices that they really largely were responsible for popularizing. Another important aspect of this is that by the early 70s, there was an awareness of how dangerous drugs were. In the 60s, there was a lot of optimism about things like LSD and expanding consciousness through drugs. But as the results of that were being seen and people were dying of overdoses, very famous people were dying of overdoses, there was a desire to find ways of expanding consciousness that didn't require drugs. So practices like yoga begin to be very popular, and Buddhist meditation as well. The mixing together of East and West happens very clearly in works. I'm just showing one. There's many, but this is a very influential book called Eastern Body, Western Mind by Anodea Judith. Anodea Judith was trained in psychology, Western psychology, and became interested in these ideas emerging out of Hindu philosophy. And so she blends them together, and she looks at the body and the mind and the chakras, and she uses it all together to work towards human development. So this book is very important in terms of bringing together Western psychology, and psychology is definitely very important for the counterculture, an interest in Carl Jung and in therapy and so on, anything that's working with developing the consciousness. And so we start to see books like this that go on to be bestsellers that are looking at combining these attitudes to psychology, the mind, bringing the mind and body together, sort of healing that Cartesian split that I talked about at the beginning of the course. As I've mentioned, there are many, many streams within the New Age movement, and it can get very confusing. So I'm just going to focus on a through line through theosophy just to keep it clear to some extent. So I want to look at Dora Kunz. So she was born in what's now called Indonesia. She was born into a Dutch family in what was then the Dutch East Indies on a plantation, and they were a theosophical family according to her biography, and she was trained in meditation from an early age by her theosophist parents. And she lives a very theosophical life where she travels the world. She lives in Australia for a period of time. And according to her biography, she's aware of her own intuitive abilities from childhood. And she goes on to become a leader within theosophy. She moves to the United States. And I do find it rather interesting that many of these people live to be very old. So regardless of how they may be viewed by mainstream medicine, whatever they're doing appears to be working. So she lives into her 90s. So when Dora Kunz gets to the United States, she's becoming a leader within the philosophical movement of theosophy, and she's also working as a healer. And so she starts to, in the 1960s, work with medical doctors and nurses in developing a practice of healing through subtle energy. And so she's bringing all these ideas from theosophy, from meditation. She teaches meditation as well. And she's very determined to bring it into the mainstream, and she's very successful at this. And she sees nurses as a key part of this because obviously nurses are dealing with sick people all the time. And also in her biography, she talks about the idea that nurses are used to suffering, and so that doesn't faze them. And so she's determined that she's going to teach these healing techniques to nurses. I know that a number of you are nurses, so you may have heard of this. This is, I believe it's an accepted practice in Ontario nursing. I'd be interested to hear your experiences. But as I said, Dora Kunz was determined to develop this practice for people in the healing professions, and she teams up with Dolores Krieger, who's an RN, and they develop what becomes known as therapeutic touch, and they both write a number of different books. So we have one of the most well-known, The Spiritual Dimension of Therapeutic Touch. Now, therapeutic touch is all over the internet. Sometimes they're emphasizing that it's scientific, and sometimes they're emphasizing the spiritual aspect, but there's no doubt it comes out of theosophy, and it comes out of a number of different Hindu ideas about healing mixed together with the Western traditions. And so according to the website of the International Association of Therapeutic Touch, the trainings began in New York, in the New York University's master's program, a course called Frontiers in Nursing, from 1972 it's been taught, according to the website, in more than 80 colleges in approximately 90 countries. So I want to just look in a little bit more detail at what actually this practice entails. This is a long quotation from The Spiritual Dimension of Therapeutic Touch, and the book goes into different ways that it can be used in medical settings, inside and outside of medical settings, looking at things like addiction, working with babies, working with various kinds of illness like arthritis. So this idea that it can be used in a variety of ways. So Kunz and Krieger write, as always, begin with relaxing the patient to give them a respite from concern about disease. If you then think of sending the energy to the patient's relaxed body, it will absorb it more readily. So there's a lot of time spent in the book on meditation and the idea that the practitioner has to center themselves and needs to have a meditative practice in order to help others. So it's not only that therapeutic touch helps the person that's being healed, it also helps the practitioner to center themselves. You also need to relax and feel the flow as it gradually comes through you. Then focus your mind very strongly for a few minutes upon the energy flow going through the area of illness. Keep your attention on the harmonic order being restored within that person's energy system. So Kunz talks a lot about this, the idea of the body as energy system, so the subtle body. And from her point of view, illness is when the subtle energies of the body become disordered. So part of what therapeutic touch is doing is reasserting order to those energy patterns. And according to her, as a clairvoyant, and this is something that also develops coming out of, particularly out of the counterculture, is the practice of medical intuition. So Carolyn Mace is another best-selling author that started out as a medical intuitive. The idea that they can see these energy patterns and can tell where the illness is in the body. So Kunz says of this ability, I have been able to perceive subtle energy since I was a child, and I'm the 5th generation of persons in my family to do so. Throughout my life, I've had unusual opportunities to learn how to use these abilities in considerable depth, and this has enabled me to keep these perceptual functions under voluntary control. I am able to see that there is a special life energy associated with the physical body. This energy keeps the physical body alive. It surrounds all the organs and keeps moving through the body somewhat like the circulation of blood, but at a finer, more subtle energy level related to the person's physical well-being. This energy flow is part of the constitution of the physical body, and it dies with the body. If a person is ill, this energy only extends a little bit beyond the physical body, whereas in health it is vibrant and can extend perhaps 6 or 8 inches. I call the subtle energy complex that is nearest the physical body and is the basis for aliveness the vital energy field. So she's putting into words these ideas that are emerging out of different parts of Eastern and Western traditions. So as you can see from this photograph, Typically, you don't actually touch the body. The understanding is that energy is channeled through the hands of the practitioner, and then they're placed just above the body. So you can do a whole body scan, which is very similar to what we saw with what Mesmer was doing. And if the illness is in a specific area of the body, then you can focus putting your hands on that part of the body. Also, nurses may use therapeutic touch in hospice care when a person is dying, just to manage pain and to create relaxation. So this is a practice that emerges out of all of these strands of the New Age movement and out of Eastern philosophy, and has come into the West and is a very common practice now.